The problem with that, of course, is that people's feelings get hurt. That is never the way you select a chair. We can talk about that later. So here are the things that I would suggest you think about in terms of what you're looking for in a chair. Skills, character, experience, and commitment. It's a great wheel to use. I think this is simply a good way to show it. I'd like to start with the character one. I believe that every chair needs courage, fire in the belly, as it were. Courage is really important right now. Courage to stand up to angry parents, to stand up to people who are making expectations of the head that are outrageous. I have a head of school client where the head and family have been attacked, not physically, but attacked verbally because some of the parents don't like the head's decisions. The chair needs to have warmth and compassion as a style, and also be able to show that in regard to caring for the head and his or her family. Has to have a family-centered approach, again, toward the head and his or her family, and yet be sensitive as well to social issues. We've had this Black Lives Matter movement growing worldwide. Chairs have to show a sensitivity to that. Experience, the ability to spot and cultivate talent for the board, the ability to take charge when necessary, and avoiding micromanagement. Under commitment, there has to be a time commitment to the time required. Serve at least 3 to 5 years. I don't believe anybody should agree to be a board chair unless they're going to serve 3 to 5 years. This idea that chairs serve 1 to 2 years is really the kiss of death for the health of schools. I did a workshop for an international school in Europe this morning, my time. The head's been there 11 years. The longest serving board member has been there 4 years. Of the board of 9, 5 are new this year. The institutional memory on that board is close to 0. Nobody remembers what this head did in the last 10 years. And we were talking about the head evaluation process and what it should look like. And a new board member with a corporate point of view was talking about metrics and was talking about how to boost this head's commitment to be a leader and to be willing to fire incompetent faculty. You know, it was all about a corporate view of the role of the head. This is going to backfire on this board and on this head. So there has to be an understanding that institutional memory comes from longer serving board members, longer serving chairs, longer serving heads, and that's what protects the school and keeps its reputation and finances intact. If you're a school where you ask people to give, a lot of international schools now increasingly are trying to create a culture of charitable giving. It would be good if the chair demonstrated that and modeled that. This is crucial. You want a chair who has no desire for or pursuit of the role. You want chairs who are reluctantly taking the role on, but once they agree to do so, they will do so with a commitment. But they're not hungry for the role. They're not seeking the role. They don't want to be in the hallways evaluating teachers. You want a chair who has a school commitment to the educational plan. In terms of skills, you'd like to see some intelligence, some collaboration, and a specific management set, maybe from a former career. Ideally, we'd have all of these, and of course we don't, but I'd like to say I think courage is one of the strongest and most important. Collaboration with the head is really important now. The courage to take risks and keep the board thinking strategically. The ability to take charge when board members stray into operations. The ability to be visionary along with the head, and that warmth and compassion in a time of stress for all. These are really important chair qualities. The Committee on Trustees, we call it in the US, overseas. You guys call it either the Governance Committee, the Policy Committee, the Nominating Committee. I believe that the policy, the governance, the nomination, all of those should be in one committee. If you want to call it the Governance Committee, that's fine. In the United States, they call it the Committee on Trustees, but it has 8 functions. And I'm a big believer that if they do all 8, if the committee does all 8, you don't need term limits. Actually, I don't think most international schools need any term limits. If you're a traditional expat international school where the average length of stay of a kid is 4 years, and the average length of a board member stay is 2 to 3 years, you would need more institutional memory. Now, a lot of international schools have become localized. They really are almost 100% local families and 100% local trustees. There's very little turnover. Kids stay from K to 12. Those schools are really not losing so much institutional memory on their board. So cultivation of a pool of prospects. That's the first job of this committee. Let's make sure there are good people waiting in the wings. to be able to take the job if asked. Secondly, screening. You want to screen prospects carefully and not even have them know they're being screened. You'd like to find out if they support the head, do they support the mission? Is their spouse going to be a problem? Are they a single issue candidate? You know, do they really want to fire the math chair or fire the hockey coach or whatever? Invitation. Nobody gives any attention to invitation. Invitation is a whole separate process that should have the chair of the board and the chair of the governance committee meet with the person and ask them 3 questions. Can you make the time? And if charitable giving is a key as well, can you give the money? And number 3, if you are a parent of a child in the school, do you realize you will be losing power to influence the education of your own child while you're gaining power to influence the mission of the school? That is a question you must ask parent board members. If that parent board member says, no way, I'm a tiger mom or a tiger dad for my kid comes first, the school does not, and a conflict arises between that child and the school or the parent and the school, and you have not made this clear upon invitation, you've got a problem. And by the way, all boards should sign a statement of confidentiality and a statement of no conflict of interest every single year. I've seen too many board members get into conflicts of interest this year. Orientation. This gets the lowest grade in our board surveys, the boards with whom we do workshops. It's the lowest grade of all the things we ask about. The orientation is never substantial. And among other things, it never talks about the history of the school. If I ask, can you name the last 4 heads of school and why they left? Most board members look at me and laugh. They don't even know what I'm talking about. Who are those people? Do we know who the last 3 chairs were and why they left? I worked with a school yesterday where the board fired the chair last year, and the chair was close with the head, so the head felt threatened. Orientation should be looking at the mistakes the board may have made in recent history and how can we learn from them. Training. I think boards should go through training every single year. Nobody ever remembers all the rules. And frankly, there's enough new ones coming on in most years that training is really necessary. This is the toughest one of all so far. This committee is charged with evaluating the chair, evaluating the board as a whole through an annual reflective process. And the part that almost never gets done is this committee is supposed to be evaluating board members whose terms are up for renewal. So if it's 2 3-year terms, at the end of that first 3 years, this committee is supposed to be sitting down with that board member and talking about, do you want to stay on? You've missed a number of meetings. You didn't sign your confidentiality agreement. We hear that you're breaking some confidences. I mean, those honest conversations almost never occur because these people are colleagues and friends. But if you do this job right, increasingly you don't need term limits. Term limits are a coward's way to remove a board member who should be removed for lack of performance. Warning of inappropriate behavior. And then frankly, removing a trustee if necessary. For international school boards that have elected board members, some of you have appointed and elected, some of you have all elected. You still have to be able to remove a board member, even an elected one, if they violate a code of conduct. So there should be an annual board review of the policy manual on code of conduct. Building connections and no surprises between the head and the board chair in particular, but with the board as a whole. The head and the chair should meet virtually. I believe that should be at least once a week, at least an hour. And frankly, I think the head and the board, as I mentioned earlier, meet with every board member twice a year, ask those 3 questions. How am I doing? How are you feeling about your role? How are your kids doing? The no surprise rule is more important than ever in this particular time. In time of uncertainty, virtual meetings with board members may seem burdensome now, but the head needs to maintain and build political capital during a time when difficult decisions will be made. So political capital with the board is hard when you're doing everything virtually. A lot of schools are open in person, but parents are not allowed in the building. A lot of the boards with whom I work are actually just now beginning to come back as boards in person, but the social bond between the board, among board members, between March and now has been frayed substantially. And if there are new board members who've joined, they don't yet have the connections they need to feel a social part of the board. Board committees. You may or may not need an executive committee. If it's a small board, you may not need one. If it's a large board, I was working with an international school board a couple of weeks ago. They have 26 board members. I know that's very large for an international school, but of the 26, 13 are on the executive committee. Think about that. They are all the chairs of all the committees. They have 12 committees. That makes the people who aren't on the executive committee feel like losers. So an executive committee should not become the most important committee on the board. It's really there as a sounding board and to act for the board as a whole if the board cannot meet. Most of us need a finance committee, which could overlook investments, audit, risk assessment, buildings and grounds. They could all fall under finance. The Committee on Trustees is the most important committee on the board, or your governance committee. I don't believe there's any committee that's more important, and I believe the person who chairs that committee is, if they don't know it, they are the most important person on the board other than the board chair. I work with a few boards where the chair of the board is also the governance committee chair. That's not appropriate. That's too much power in the hands of one person. But the chair of the board has enormous power. The board chair appoints all committees, all committee chairs, and the members of all committees in consultation with the sub-chairs. But the point is, this governance committee should have someone heading it up who is the most respected member of the board other than the chair. Buildings and grounds you may or may not have. It may fall under finance. Strategic planning could be an ad hoc committee. I'm an advocate that probably it'd be a standing committee. Development or advancement. This is if you are into the fundraising part of the job. There are a lot of international schools that don't really do this. Your advancement director is not a fundraiser, does not get involved in fundraising. It's more about communications and PR and marketing. But if you are a school that raises money, advancement or development committee is appropriate. The head support committee, I consider the second most important committee on the board. This is the chair plus 2 others appointed by the chair. And this committee has 3 jobs: reviewing the head's evaluation every year, looking over the head's compensation and package going forward each year, and reviewing the head's contract for renewal. Those are the 3 jobs of the head support committee. There should not be an education committee. There should not be a personnel committee. There should not be an athletic or a school life committee. All of those committees are backdoor entrances for parent board members to engage in the realm of where the head is supposed to operate. The head serves on the governance committee and all committees ex officio, as does the chair. The head participates in screening potential trustees. The head has some voice in chair selection. They'll be careful here, because if the head prefers someone who doesn't get chosen, the chair who is chosen may have some issues there. There's a temptation to add more committees that intrude into operations. I think an example of a dysfunctional board is a board that meets too often, for too long, with too many subcommittees. I also believe that most board meetings should be limited to about 2 hours, and the first hour should be committee reports, all of which should be sent out in writing in advance anyway. The head of schools report should not take a long time. There should not be a lot of administrators from the leadership team sitting around the boardroom. That sometimes intimidates board members, probably just the CFO and maybe one other in addition to the head. So just be aware not to have these other subcommittees. Another sign of dysfunction, besides too many subcommittees and too long meetings, is where the real board meeting occurs when everybody leaves the boardroom and either goes back to the car, or if you're not meeting in person, gets in touch on social media. I'm a big advocate of this rule, and I will tell you this is a new rule in the time of social media. Board members should not be communicating with each other on any form of social media about board business or school business, unless it's just about your own child, with any other board member, unless you're doing it with all board members, or any committee member, unless it's specifically a committee membership that you're talking with. And this is to avoid forming factions and cliques based around subgroups and factions on the board. Some of you have heard me speak before, know that I use this phrase, and I know it's tough, I know it's hard, but I really believe that when a board is facing a crisis, you should always remember to do 3 things: circle the wagons, shut up, and support your head. Circle the wagons means don't fragment, don't break ranks. Shut up does not mean don't talk. It means don't talk outside the boardroom. Support your head means don't throw your head under the bus now or ever, but certainly not now. I think if boards remember that, they will respond thoughtfully, not reactively. They will be wise. Wisdom is the single most important trait in a board member, not a matrix of skills and background that you can buy in the marketplace. What you want in your board members is a personal trait to know how to react under pressure. You want wisdom. And you want boards that remember they have only 3 jobs: hiring, nurturing, supporting, affirming, evaluating, and if necessary, firing the head, mission integrity, and fiscal oversight. All other areas of program, curriculum, management, personnel falls under the head of school and his or her staff and not directly to the board. Input and communications are now more important than ever. The board members have to try not to wear the parent hat. The healthiest boards in the world are frankly self-perpetuating boards, not elected boards. Elected boards very much come from the American public school elected board, where parents do believe they represent other subsets of the community. All parent boards tend to be difficult. The best probably would be a board that was maybe 60% present parents and the other 40% past parents, grandparents, alumni, or maybe once in a while, someone like the embassy rep or whatever. Boards don't breach confidentiality, which is one of the biggest governance issues we have. Boards don't micromanage. Boards don't talk outside the boardroom, the faculty or staff or parents. This is a challenge for board members who are current parents. Had another client recently, we're in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Board members began to have private conversations with parents and staff without the permission of the board chair, without the knowledge of the board chair or the head. And these conversations led to some damaging outcomes. That should never have happened. The head has to allow for limited board input in selection of senior administrators. The board has only 1 employee, but the head is wise to allow limited board input into the selection of key administrators, particularly the chief financial officer, maybe the deputy head, maybe some of the division heads. Again, just to be politically thoughtful about people with whom the board members may have to work. The head needs to be responsive appropriately to parents, the clients, but also be able to toe the line and stand up to parents who are being overly intrusive. Boundaries and channels. Board has to act as one with no one trustee having authority in his or own right. Only the chair speaks for the board, nobody else. Always directs faculty and staff and parents with issues to the division head or the teacher or the head of school first. One board member who's a new board member asked me yesterday in a workshop, what do I do when I'm addressed by a fellow parent who's a friend of mine who wants me to talk about the math program, believes the math program is too weak. Guess what? Worldwide, everybody thinks it's too weak. What's my responsibility? I thought my responsibility was probably to go to the head of school with this. I said, no, that's not your responsibility, because this parent already went to the head of school. So when you're saying you're willing to go to the head of school, you're carrying that parent's issue, that parent's water back to the head, and you're undermining the head of school. The head has to avoid showing favorites. If you have a spouse or partner working there, avoid evaluating that person. Remember that education and disciplinary issues may arise about the head's own children, and that can be a conflict. Evaluation of the head. This is a real touchy one right now. I believe the head should be evaluated through an ad hoc head support committee. I mentioned 3 people, the chair plus 2 others. This committee also evaluates the head's contract and compensation. Types of evaluation methods to avoid. If you've heard me speak before, you know that I'm 100% opposed to the concept of 360. 360 does not work in independent or international schools. It may work in the corporate context, but it is not transferable to our context. Sounds good, sounds logical, but if you think about it, most heads were teachers. Most teachers are caregivers, not risk takers. Most heads initially, when they come into the job, are not very good at conflict management. Who wants conflict management? So how are heads going to be in meeting the board demand to act more like a CEO, to be able to make critical judgments and even firing people if necessary. If, by the way, every tough decision you make is going to come back to bite you in the rear end, because all those people are going to say something negative about you to the board if there's a 360. So what heads learn is I don't make any tough decisions. I try to be nice to everybody and please everybody, because otherwise, if I do something more severe, it's going to come back to hurt me in the evaluation process. Or the other way to put it and make it clear to board members, no corporate CEO has board members whose children are influenced by the CEO's employees. But heads have board members whose children are influenced by the head's employees, meaning the teachers. So it is not a relevant comparison. I believe the head support process should be simple, not complex. I do not believe you need a massive job description. I do not believe you should make it a bureaucratic nightmare for the head to get through. It should be simple, annual, in writing, and involves every board member. And here's what I recommend. The head and the head support committee get together and talk about 3 to 5 goals for the year. They probably relate to the strategic goals of the school, not a job description. Those goals, once agreed upon, should be brought to the full board for approval. We want the whole board to buy into them or change them. Sometime in the middle of the year, the head meets with this committee and gives them some evidence of progress. In the spring of the year, every single board member fills out and signs an evaluation of the head's performance against those goals and sends them to the chair. The head does his or her own self-evaluation and sends it to the chair. The committee then meets with the head and looks at where are you compared to where we are? Are we on the same line? Out of that comes a 2-page report written by the chair that goes in the file for the head, recommendations for work still needing to be done and commendations for good work already done. I think that's all you need to be a really thoughtful board acting for a good head evaluation process. The head needs to be responsive to board questions about teacher compensation, evaluation, and accountability and not become defensive. Board members should not be knowing individual teachers' compensation or individual teachers' evaluation, but they should know that those systems exist and they should know something about them. You need to be responsive to board's questions about finances without allowing them to get in the weeds. So these are the problematic issues. Executive session, why not? I don't believe you should ever go into executive session unless it's a legal issue or a moral issue or the head's contract issue. Because otherwise, heads don't know what's going on in those meetings. If you do them regularly, it also often creates distrust or mistrust between the parties. I don't believe in town meetings, either virtually or in person, because they're dangerous, because it's usually an angry minority that shows up. Did you hear the story of the European school where the board heard negative messages about the head whose contract was coming up for renewal? So they hired a firm to do a school climate survey in May, never do one in May. They only got 25% of the parent responses back, but the parent responses were pretty critical. The board was shocked. This is a true story. So the board fired the head. They basically paid him off for the last year. And many of you know this head. And guess what happened? Can you guess? The 75% of the parents who did not answer the survey were in fact happy with the head. And they rose up in rebellion, overthrew the board, and rehired the head. What does that tell you? Social media, how to deal with it and who responds to it and who responds to negativity in social media. Board members' own activity on social media. We have to be careful about that. Parents always want voice and transparency, and we can all believe in that to a certain extent, but where does it end? How far down does the rabbit hole go for transparency? Sometimes we can't move fast enough or please people enough, so we have to find a balance. We have to remember that the head of school is the center of the hourglass. The top of the hourglass is the board, and the bottom of the hourglass are all the stakeholders. You cannot run past the center of the hourglass. If you do an end run, you break the model of the school that normally works. So heads have to find appropriate ways to listen to parents without creating structures that will be challenging to manage. In other words, don't create faculty advisory committees. Don't allow the Parents Association to become the intermediary interpreters of parent voice rather than having parents talk to the administration and teachers directly. That's very dangerous. Okay, now we're going to do a case study. Are there any questions at this point before we move into the case study? You can use your chat box or you can undo your microphone. If no questions, here's what I plan to do. The Sunridge School case is written here. You don't have a copy of it. I'm going to read it aloud. I hope you can remember most of it, because once you are put off into your breakout rooms, you will not have this on your screen. So we're going to use you in breakout rooms. I think we're going to have maybe 5. So there might be 4 or 5 people in each room. We'll see. But whenever you show up in the breakout room, the first thing I'd like you to do is to choose a facilitator. Please do that right away. If somebody's too shy, just ask someone to do it. The facilitator has 4 jobs. Keep everybody on time. You have 20 minutes for this case. Secondly, make sure everybody answers the questions at the bottom. Third, hopefully you were able to read it as I read it now and remember it. And finally, are there any rules of good governance, good practices of governance that you're aware of that are being violated in this case? So when we come back from the breakout room, I would like the facilitators to be able to give us a summary of the tone of your meeting, the answers to the questions, and also which governance rules were in play in this case. So this is a real school. This is recent. This is not made up. We've just changed the name. That's all. So Sunridge is a K-12 school with a diverse but divided board. Some of the board members are local businessmen and educators. The remaining members are current parents with deep connections to other parents, both personally and professionally in the community. A group of current parents led by one very prominent local figure with deep ties to the constituents strongly expressed their disappointment that the board is not more transparent in its decision-making. They also questioned the board's fiscal oversight of the school. These parents want more engagement in the daily operations of the school and want to explore the possibility of a new governance structure. 2 longer-term board members and the board chair are either rotating off the board or no longer want to serve. The new board chair is open to these ideas, the new one is, and the parents feel encouraged that 2 new board members will be receptive as well. A board meeting is held, and the head of school at the last minute is asked to leave the meeting. The chair calls for an executive session. The board responds to the parents' concerns as follows. It will form a task force to examine the school's governance structure and take another look at and perhaps revisit the financial decisions that have been made, particularly during the pandemic. Parents will be invited to monthly coffees with the board and will be allowed to submit agendas for agenda items for consideration at each board meeting. They will attend board meetings if their agenda items are accepted for discussion. The parents are encouraged by these actions, which they believe are steps towards reestablishing trust between the parents and the board. The head is feeling overwhelmed by trying to cope with these expectations and the increasing and multiple sources of power. So the questions are, what do you think of these steps on the part of the board and the parents? What principles of best practice, meaning governance, are in play here? What should the head do and what should the chair do? So those are the 4 questions. I hope you can remember them. I'll go back and show you the first part of the case. Someone's got their microphone open so we can hear the background. Take a look at this again. And here's the second part. So when I ask Ed to do this, he's going to put you into the breakout rooms. And again, you've got about 20 minutes and you'll be given a 1-minute warning of when to come back. And when you come back, we'll talk about the case as a whole. Are there any questions? Feel free to undo your mic if you have a question before we go to the breakout room.
Do you think of these steps on the part of the board and the parents? The principles of the
Okay,
Will we have
everybody there?
access to the questions while we're in the breakout room?
If you have questions now, ask me now before we go to the breakout room.
No, but will we see the 4 questions or should we write them down before?
I think you should write them down because we didn't send the case out in advance. So if you can take a pencil and pen, what do you think of the steps that the board and parents are taking? What governance principles are in play? What should the head do? What should the chair do? Hopefully those are easy enough to remember. And again, I'll go back to the first part of the case quickly for you to reread if you wish, just really quickly here.
So some of the board members have looked at this assessment remaining.
Remember, this is a real situation. Facts are not changed.
In connections with other parents, who are current parents that are longer commonly deep ties become strong to the board is not more.
So the key issues here are powerful member of the community, subset of disgruntled parents, 3 key board members leaving, new chair and 2 other new ones coming in, shift of direction in the school, head being asked to leave an executive session, the board responding to the parents' concerns and allowing small coffees to be held to raise agendas. And if that agenda is accepted, that parent has a right to go to the board meeting to talk about those. And the head is concerned about loss of power. Okay, Ed, can you put us into the breakout rooms?
Could you please make sure you unmute? Thank you.
So who's the facilitator here? Jane, Brian, May, are you guys there? Hello?
Hey, John,
Yeah, anybody else in this room?
I don't know what, I don't know what's happened here.
Yeah.
Looks like everybody came back. Ah,
Okay,
Oh,
We got
Yeah,
kicked
we-
out.
They all got
we've
kicked out.
all
okay,
been
let's
kicked
try
out.
again. Let's
Go
try
ahead,
again.
before we send you back, guys, remember, every group has to have a facilitator right away, because we do have to have somebody who summarizes. So Ed, push everybody back out again, would you?
Okay, doke.
We have another 54 seconds to go.
Hey, Ed, is this a group or not? Are Brian and Jane there?
Yeah, there are 7, and I've been to all of them, and other. No, hold on.
Hello, everybody. Okay, well, I'm hoping most people are back, although not everybody. So Jane, you were a kind of a facilitator of two, right? Or maybe three? Jane?
Yep, we had two people, two other
Okay.
people, yeah.
So Jane, why don't you start and give us quickly your summary of what's going on and your quick answers to those questions.
Oh my gosh. Well, we thought that the group had gone a little bit off of their governance best practices by initially cutting out the head of school and some of their decision making. With the turnover on the board, they were in a place where they were losing some of their institutional memory and history. And they were making quick decisions that probably weren't aligned with their governance practices that were going to have an impact. So we didn't find much about best practice. We found things that tended to fly in the face of best practice. We thought that that initially there needed to be a series of meetings that had to take place, and what those looked like, I kind of didn't have the case study, so we can't remember who's who, but the head of school and possibly the old board chair and the new board chair need to get together to have a conversation to better understand what's going on and to revisit some of the governance
Jane,
structures.
That's good. Let me stop you there so we don't cover everything.
All right.
David Butcher, you were a facilitator for your group. What would you pick up from what Jane said? How would you answer those questions?
Very similar with a couple of nuggets, John, in terms of we felt that the board was slightly vulnerable in terms of turnover, so it's a destabilizing time, and it's been quite politicized with people bringing their own agendas in. The isolation of the head was clearly a huge warning sign for the school in many ways, with the lack of communications. Communication kept coming back on a couple of times. It would appear that the chair of the Board of Governors may not have had the training to deal with such a situation that, again, left the whole group in a vulnerable position. Strategic was being marginalized versus the operational. People are trying to micromanage the school. And we felt that there needed to be a regroup of the board and the head of school, the chair of the board, possibly bringing in some institutional memory, maybe a previous board chair, to restabilize the situation with the school and the governance of the school, and certainly one-to-one meetings be possible to go back to those who have caused the destabilization.
Okay, thank you, David. Udo, I think you were a facilitator for your group.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I put the first and the second question together and give some answers. So what happened? Well, it seems to be that this board became kind of a committee of parents. Yeah. So it's kind of an opening of the circle of wagons. What happened there? Then this, well, maybe can call kind of ridiculous action of the parents being allowed to put agenda items there for the board meetings and then even attend these board meetings. Violations of good practice, best practice that we see is this level of parent involvement that happened there, going to the point of where the head of the school was asked to leave the board meeting. Yeah. In a sense, this board created an operational committee or operational committees here. The succession planning for the board meetings, and especially of the board chair, was sure not the best practice, with even the point that a new board member became chair right away. What should the head and the previous or even the new chair do? Well, one simple thing: call John Littleford and ask him to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Udo. Who else was a facilitator? Was anybody else a facilitator on the screen here?
Yeah,
Yeah, I was.
Okay, Shani, go ahead.
Okay, so I think people have covered the main things, but I think in our group we saw this as a problem that there's no mission-driven thinking going on here, and that everybody's kind of operating on their own personal ideas, and that I think this is a very textbook case of the broken hourglass. There should be the board up here, the head here, and the stakeholders down here, and there's just all kinds of things going on there that are breaking the hourglass. And there's a conflict between the short-term interests of the parents and the kind of strategic role of the board and the sort of third person party looking in on what's going on rather than micromanaging all the details. There was talk in terms of what the head and the chair should do. There just has to be conversations going on here. The head needs to get the chair on board to get to see the vision of governance that has been in place, or to fix the vision of governance, and the chair needs to listen, but there are certain problems with that, in that the chair is new. There's no institutional memory in the board, the chair and those two people who've just come on board, and they may be just going gung-ho without any consideration of what's come before. Another issue is that everybody's kind of in my situation and in the situation of the people in my group, we're saying the board, they have other jobs, and as soon as this kind of conflict comes up, it just turns into, explodes all the work that they're supposed to be doing, and they don't have time to sit down and listen. They don't have time to manage this, and this can cause all kinds of problems as well. So the main thing is, yeah, please go. Sorry.
Who's the other facilitator?
I was a facilitator as well.
Okay, Michael, go ahead. Was it you, Michael?
No, it's Darren, sorry.
Oh, so where's Darren? Can't see. Oh, Darren, up there. Go ahead, Darren.
There you go. And one of the things that we mentioned was that obviously in the current situation, the feeling of loss of control is completely natural. So these parents who are feeling that they've had a loss of control, it's a natural occurrence in a time of crisis. So there's a certain amount of a need to understand that this is not necessarily out of the ordinary. It's a natural response. One of the things that we also talked about was looking at the actual root of this. What was the lack of communication that these parents actually felt was going on? How has the school and the board actually put across these decision-making processes? How have they communicated it? We talked about the head needing communication and dialogue with the new board chair, also using the existing board members as well as the institutional memory. So using those existing board members who have not left as stabilizing factors within the board, have the head reach out to them, but also reach out to the community to and use the connection that he has within the community, he or she, to build that, maybe bring in a third party to try and decompress the whole situation, look at what was good in the way that the board operated in the past and use that, go back to the board policy and use that as the central part of decision making for the future.
Okay, Darren, thanks. Any other facilitators in the room that I missed?
Just
Okay,
one.
Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just as a real summary, the idea that sometimes you need to go back before you go forward. So the idea that, as Jane said, reestablishing the relationship between the chair and the head, but also a review of roles and decision-making and structure, just so there's no disappointments going forward and there's real clarity and alignment.
So what's strange here is this was a head who was in his first year last year. So this is the second year. Secondly, it turns out that the parents who are demanding a voice and demanding to be a part of the agenda represent about 25% of the parent body. The other 25% are pretty happy, and they are not the ones demanding these coffees and setting agendas and going to the board meetings. So there are clearly factions and a fragmented parent body made up of different demographics. Interestingly enough, 90% of the parents really support this head. and think this head's doing a great job. So put yourself in the position of this head right now. What would you be doing? By the way, how many of you on this screen are currently heads of school? You're currently in the role of head of school. Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay, 7, 8 of you. So what do you think this head's doing? James, what do you think?
Well, I'd be, one of the things that we had talked about in our group too was, I mean, what's the head doing? Probably panicking. But I think you got to go back to your statement about the relationship with the chair has got to be the first point of contact. And so, because if that relationship's damaged, then we have there's no sense moving forward before that relationship is either reestablished or fixed somehow. And at least then as a head of school, you know what you're dealing with and what the
So here's the
situation
problem. The chair with whom this head had a bond left, was posted elsewhere. So there's a new chair that was brought in, and the new chair has been on the board before, but totally new to this role. And remember, there's 2 new board members. And the 2 new board members kind of represent this minority of 25%. So the board actually now has 3 factions. One faction representing this outside influential person, one faction representing kind of the American embassy, and one faction kind of representing everybody else. So you've got a new head, you've got a new chair, you've got a loss of institutional memory, you've got a highly active minority of parents who want to set the agenda. When the chair whispered to the head to leave the room, that was an incredible loss of respect and embarrassment for the head. So raise your other heads in the room. Laurie, if you were this head right now, what would you be doing?
Well, I would be trying to demonstrate that I listen, but I'd be calling in all the institutional support that I have to try and get a sense of how the community feels, and trying to bring people back together. But I would be in constant dialogue with the board chair, letting her know about what was going on, seeking her advice. But I would be trying very hard to show that I am listening, that I'm not dogmatic, but trying to bring people back to what the key point is. And the key point is the role of the board is to get up, way up in the sky, have a look down and see the future. And that it's my job to deal with the other stuff.
Well, you know, Laurie, that's really great. And I think the head of school should have done that. But the head of school was probably more intimidated than you are or were. So the other thing is fight or flight. I think this head thought about flight rather than fight. So the head reached out to headhunters quietly and discreetly, asking them to keep him in mind. If not for this July, then for sure for the following July. The strange thing about that, though, is that if this head does land the job, some 90% of those parents will be extremely disappointed that this happened. So, Chip, what are your thoughts? What should the head do? What should the board do? What should the chair do?
Well, I was going to first interject, John, that we call that the Kenny Rogers move. You got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them.
So if you were this head, what would you do?
Well, I think that a bit like James and Jane were saying, I think you have to kind of step back, because clearly there seems to be a change or a misunderstanding of what the roles and responsibilities of the board are, number one, because it clearly has now been called into question. And number two, the business of once you come on the board, it doesn't matter what your status is, what your culture is, where you work, what nationality you are, what gender you are. Once you step into the boardroom, you leave all that stuff at the door, and you come in looking for what's best for the school. And the third one that came up in our group is, you know, it's not really a democracy. It's not like running by, it's not a political kind of a thing. And even though there are elections, you're not responsive to a constituency. And I think That's hard.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. That's absolutely right. I think one of the toughest things for parent elected boards, I always say to parent elected boards, you may have gotten into the room because you were elected, but once you're in the room, you no longer represent the parents. What do you represent? If you don't represent the parents as a board member, what or who do you represent?
You represent the best interests of the school. I mean, you have to think, and you're thinking more about the future.
Yes, absolutely. You represent the mission. I
Yeah.
find it very hard when I say to parent board members, you guys don't represent just the current parents. You represent the past parents, the alumni, the current parents, the current students, and the future parents and the future students. You have to remember, you have to leave a legacy as a board member, leaving the school stronger than what you found. And if you think you get into the boardroom and you have a narrow parochial interest in representing just the current parents, you are mistaken, because you may think due to the election, you represent a narrow political group, but if you do that, you'll bring the school down. You will not even serve the best interest of your own child. So I think that need to be thinking about the future as well as the present is really crucial. And the head of school, of course, in the center of this hourglass, has to work with the board on top and all the stakeholders underneath. This head needs either, by the way, did you hear anything in this case at all about a governance committee? There's no mention of a governance committee. There's no mention of a governance chair. There's no mention of any disciplinary process brought to bear against board members who are breaking ranks. You basically have a lot of board members here who are breaking confidences, leaking from the boardroom, forming factions, forming groupings with other parents in the community. And frankly, anything the head of school says is immediately leaked outside the boardroom, and the board knows it cannot speak in confidence at all. So they're having a very hard time getting back to some norm. Now, going back to maybe what Darren was saying earlier about anxiousness, the parents are anxious. They're anxious about cost. They're anxious about quality. They're anxious about the cost-benefit ratio of their money. They're anxious about possibly going back into distance learning. So all of their normal behaviors of anxiety, which might have been held in check, the checks seem to be off because this is a pandemic time. And they're frankly worried about their kids losing educational opportunities. So, and this is what heads are dealing with. Heads are dealing with anxious parents who are off the wall. They are behaving in ways that are just an extreme of what we may have seen in the past. And, you know, I don't see this pandemic being over in January or February or March. I mean, it's looking like even when the vaccine is out, which vaccine? There's so many versions of the vaccine. A lot of people aren't going to get vaccinated. We're talking, I think, another year anyway. So we can't live with poor governance and accept it and just assume somehow we'll get through it. I think too many heads are going to go nuts here. I want to tell you a story about a head of school who was being attacked about a number of issues: Black Lives Matter issue, a pandemic issue, a distance learning issue. And this board was chastised and taken to account. And as a result of that, the board decided to publicly support the head, put out a statement to the broader community of its support for the head, to make sure it was clear to faculty and alumni and parents and the general community that despite the attacks the school may have been under or the head had personally been under, they were supporting this head. That completely turned the relationship between the head and the board around, and the relationship among the board members themselves. 3 board members resigned because they could not take that oath, but everybody else stayed on. So before our time runs out tonight, I want to ask if there's any questions about what I said earlier in the PowerPoint, or any questions about this. But by the way, this case is not yet resolved. The head is still looking. The board is still struggling. To be honest with you, it's still a mess. So there has been no positive conclusion that I can convey to you about this case. So any questions at all about the rules of engagement that we've been talking about here today? Okay. If not, let me tell you a story. We all remember stories.
I have a question, John.
Janie.
Fundamentally, in this situation, do you feel that the head or the chair needs to kind of take charge? Or is that like up to personality, context, situation, or do you have a sort of a black and white view of this, or is it gray?
Well, the problem is the chair is not a take charge person.
Mm.
The chair is a pleaser and is very aware of the political relationships of the board members that the chair needs to stay in touch with. The head of school is a decisive, strong person who now feels as though his wings have been clipped, and so he's not nearly as willing to be a strong leader. It's like what I say to boards. If you give a head a bad evaluation, and then you expect the head to be a strong, decisive, confident leader, look in the mirror. Would you do that? So basically, when you slam a head of school, you undermine that head of school's willingness and ability to be a strong leader. So they don't have a partnership right now, those two. It's the wrong partnership. So good question. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Is there a way to, properly address issues from the community to have them funneled up through?
Well, here's what I would suggest, and you might do it in different ways, but I've got a client school where the parents are pretty much up in arms. Some segment is up in arms about a lot of things. So the head of school is new, and the head of school has decided the parents are not allowed on campus. Kids are in session, but parents are not allowed on campus. So this head is holding Zoom meetings with up to 20 parents signing up each. The meetings are at various times of day and evening, and even on the weekends. This head of school is a woman who's new to the role, and she is basically holding meetings like we're having right now, and she wants to hear from the parents. She's using these Zoom meetings as an opportunity to learn the names of the parents, to understand about their anxieties, to understand about their aspirations. The meetings last about an hour with about 15 parents in each group, maybe 20. The only rule is you don't talk over anybody else. You don't comment on anybody else's comments. You just talk to me, and everybody gets a chance to talk, and everybody will talk. This head's going to do that for every parent in the school. And there's a lot of parent families in the school. And what the head is attempting to do is to build a personal connection with every parent, and not just run the school as a CEO from top down, but also not to let the barbarians in at the gate. It's a question of having a relationship of listening. And if she hears a criticism, she might say, "Thank you for telling me, I hadn't heard that before." She might hear a criticism and say, "I have heard that before, and here's the progress we've made on that." Or she might say, "I've heard that before, but that's not true, and let me tell you what is the truth." So not being defensive. And generally, this head is also having in the meeting, every one of these meetings, there is her principal of that division and a board member at her choice. So she has two other sets of ears listening in the room. And they're doing this by grade level. So 15 or 20 parents from each grade level until she hears from most of the parents. So I think that is better than holding a town meeting or a very, very large group, either in person or by Zoom, where there's too many people to have any kind of a relationship with. But I do think heads need to be proactive listeners. I am not an advocate of school climate surveys. I'm not an advocate of parent opinion surveys, because I've seen them be manipulated. I've seen parents get together to have collective answers. I've seen really nasty comments that have come through on some of those. And if those get published and sent out, they can become very hurtful. So I really believe that kind of focus group approach may be safer and healthier and more productive than surveys. But it is time consuming for a head of school. Actually, we're 1 minute from closure. Anything else anybody wants to ask? So I want to thank, oh yes, go ahead, Janina.
We have one of those AGMs that you don't recommend going on this very afternoon. So if you'd like to give us any advice, we definitely have an angry minority attending.
Okay, Janina, I'll just tell you, this is a quick story. This is a true story. You probably all know this because it happened in your region. But some years ago, not too many, I got a call from the vice chair of a board in the IRCOS organization. And he said, "Listen, we're having some challenges between the board and the teachers and the board and the head of school. And we're looking for an outsider to be a consultant to do an institutional assessment of both the board and other policies within the school." I said, "That sounds like a really big job." And he said, yes, but I don't have time to talk to you about it now. I've got to go to a town meeting. And I said, what's the town meeting about? And he said, well, a bunch of parents, we're not sure how many, are planning to show up to talk to us about what their gripes are about some of the recent board decisions. And I said, where's it going to be held? In the gym. I said, do you have board supporters there? He said, no, we haven't worked on that. And I said, will the head be there? He said, I don't know, I guess so. And I said, how many board members are coming? He said, the whole board. And I said, can I make a suggestion? He said, what? Don't have the meeting. Cancel it, postpone it, don't have it. He said, I can't possibly do that. We're too far along. I'll call you back in a couple of days so we can talk about a request for a proposal. He calls me 3 days later. And he says, Mr. Littleford, you're hired. I said, what do you mean I'm hired? He said, the town meeting was a disaster. It was a setup. There were 200 parents. 100 were faculty parents. 100 were friends of the faculty parents. They took the board to task. They yelled at us. They screamed at us. They said, we don't care about parents. We actually believe the head of school may have been behind this because he certainly was not in the room. We are furious. We want to hire you. I said, well, with all due respect, I'm in Switzerland at the moment. I don't have time to come out there and help you, but I wish you the best. If you can guess what happened is the board got angry at the head. Either the head resigned or was fired, depending on how you look at it. The faculty went on strike. The high school kids went on strike wearing black armbands, marching around the school. The press came out and covered it. It was in the Far Eastern Economic Review, which is why I know all of this. The board resigned. They went to hire an interim head for 2 years, and then finally they hired another head. And then 3 to 4 years later, the disaster was put to bed and the school was back on track. But we're talking about a 4-year hiatus that I believe was triggered by the town meeting as an incident that blew up everything. So Janina, don't do it, don't go. This other quick story. I was actually at a town meeting where the board chair stood up, angry mob in the room. He said, listen, we need 2 new board members. Anybody in the room want to volunteer? And 2 people raised their hand and they had said to me, oh no, those are the worst people in the parent body. But they were the only 2 who raised their hand. So they became members of the board. What a disaster. Anyway, let's avoid that. So Ed, thank you very much for sponsoring us tonight. I
Thank
wish
you,
you all
John.
well.
And I want to thank all of you for taking time to show up. And I hope that you're coping as well as can be. And please let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to pull together for more sessions. And there is more information coming out in the next week or so about additional events. I do want to say, since we're together, just so you know, that the ELC that we moved to the end of April, we now have to move forward once again, and it will actually be moved to the end of October 2021, and fingers crossed that it's going to actually happen and, you know, we can get together as real people again. But I wish you well. I know it's hard times and a lot of stress, and just stay well. And thank you for all that you're doing across the region. And for that, I'm going to say good night, and you have a good morning. And John, again, thank you so much for your contributions and your thinking, and some entertaining stories as well.
Thanks,
So
everybody.
Thank you all. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Will we get a copy of this?
It will be, yes, I'm going to turn the recording off now. So we'll have it up sometime next week. It'll be on the website. We've got a section for former. The first 3 minutes won't be there because I forgot to turn it on. So,
Thank you for this, Ed. It was fantastic. I really
okay,
love
thank you.
listening to John.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.